让我们用掌声欢迎诚行之士的制作人 Jonathan Blow 和 Gamirror Games 日本分公司 CEO 轩科登场。今天，轩科将会担任吹哥的翻译。
Oh, hi. I'm Jonathan Blow. I'm the director of the game, and this whole thing is my strange idea, which I'll do my best to explain today, actually.
各位好，我叫轩科，我是 Gamirror Games 日本分公司的 CEO。然后今天我是帮吹哥的贴身翻译，来帮吹哥和大家交流。你看，请大家多多关照，谢谢。
好的，那么接下来我们就把现场交给吹哥，让他来开始今天的分享吧。
So today I want to talk about why the game is the way that it is, and it might get maybe a little bit nerdy, but I wanted to give the real information, so this is what we'll see today.
今天我们会介绍这个游戏的一些设计上的思路，然后内容可能会比较窄一项，但是呢，我希望大家能够听下去，然后能够加深一些对这个游戏的理解。
So I want to start with an image or an idea that I first heard when Kim Swift from the Portal team gave a presentation at the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco sometime around 2007. I can't actually find video of the talk, but I remember it, and I will communicate something about it today.
OK， 所以今天我是想要以Kim Swift Portal 这个游戏的
I don't know. I mean, at Valve, they kind of all contribute, so I don't know if there's titles.
总之，他是Portal 游戏开发组的一个成员。然后呢，他在2007年的 GDC 游戏开发者大会上给过一个 presentation， 一个演讲。然后他今天想要引用这个游戏当时这个演讲里面的内容来向大家解说。
And she put forth this image about how to design a game, or how to know that your game design is good, that involved making a sort of a spreadsheet or a diagram where you figure out what are the objects in my game, and you can make a little grid, and you can put, along one row, and the top, and the left. There's a lot of latency in the mouse, so I don't know about that. But along the top and the left, you put all the same list of objects, and then anytime when they interact, you fill in one of the squares.
所以Team 在当时说的时候，他们在制作传送门的时候，用过一种设计思路，就是做一个这样的一个表格，然后这个表格里面会把这个游戏里面的一些特有的元素进行组合，比如说左边是玩家盒子按钮，然后上面那一排是同样的东西，但是呢，你在进行组合的时候，从上往下进行排列。
So for example, in Portal, there's this box you can put on a button, and so in the graph here we have a box on the top and button on the side, and in that cell we said, well, the box can push the button and hold it down.
所以像刚刚说的这个，它有横列，然后它有纵列。当你在里面选择一个单元格的时候，比如说盒子，然后有一个按钮，那盒子它和按钮交界的地方就是怎么去跟这两个元素进行组合，比如说按钮，在这个盒子上面有一个按钮可以按。
Similarly, there's turrets in the game, and so the turret can interact with the player by killing the player. And, these are just two boxes that I've filled in because I wanted to show it, but the idea is as you design the game, you would be filling in more and more boxes as you decide how things interact.
然后另一个例子是这个炮塔，炮塔和玩家的组合起来之后，就是可以把玩家给杀死。然后在游戏的开发过程中，你会增加越来越多的元素，然后在这个表格上扩展它的内容。
Now, I don't think that she came up with this idea. There's a long history of variations of this in design. For example, this is where I think she probably got it from, this book called Game Architecture and Design, the year 1999.
OK， 我不知道他是不是受到这本书的启发，就是在1999年的时候，他曾经有这样的一本书叫《游戏的架构和设计》。
And, in this book, they have this example of this very old game, Pong, one of the first video games. There's just two paddles that are really just straight lines, and they knock this dot back and forth, and there's a score. And over here in this book, they did a grid version of Pong, except instead of a square grid, they've just done the triangle because, if you have a square for bat and ball, you don't necessarily need ball and bat. So, for example, that area is empty.
OK， 然后我不知道Team 当时是有没有受这个书的启发，可能是，但是呢，这本书里面用到这样的一个设计思路，大家可以看到这是一个 Pong 的截图，就是有点像乒乓的一个游戏，可能很多人都知道。然后这个游戏当时用的一个思路是很像刚刚的那个竖轴和横轴的一个设计，但是它用的是一个阶梯型的一个结构。然后呢，在这个结构上，比如说你可以看到球和球中间不会产生互动，所以它放了一个叉，是这样的一个感觉，有点不一样，但很相似。
And again, in the various cells here, it's listed what happens. But what you'll see from this diagram is most of the cells have this big X, which means nothing happens, right? So for example, there's only one ball in Pong, so a ball cannot interact with a ball. Your bat that you hit things with cannot interact with the goal that the balls go in, and so forth.
所以 Pong 这个游戏非常的简单。我们刚刚已经提到了，有些元素和元素中间它们不会产生互动。然后后面我们还会再继续提到这个概念。
We'll come back to that in a minute. I wanted to go through a couple more just historical examples. So this is the first reference that I found where game designers did this, but in general design of machines and so forth, people have been doing this for something like it for a long time. And so this is from 1965, and I like in this diagram the way that they do this sort of half grid shape. I think it's very nice.
OK， 所以刚刚这个概念其实呢，它虽然在电子游戏领域里面就被应用到了，但它的出处其实要更早，可以向前追溯到1965年的这个机械设计。我们可以看到这样的一个图表，它是一台机器的设计。
And here's an even older one from 1963, and it shows, that sometimes you might use half of this matrix, but also sometimes, if you care about the order of things, if one thing acting on another thing or going before another thing is different from swapping, then you would use the whole grid.
OK， 然后在这个图其实更早，它是1963年的一个设计。然后呢，他很喜欢这个图的设计思路，也就是说，如果你不想把所有的元素跟所有元素的给你交叉，你可以把它划成一半。
Okay, and I want to introduce one more, since we're visualizing things, one more way to look at the same kind of a system. So on the left is this diagram for Pong that we just saw. And on the right, I have a version of the same information that's in the form of a graph.
然后呢，这个图其实还有另外一种呈现形式。然后左边是刚刚的那个 Pong 的那个游戏的图，然后右边是这个图的对应的一个呈现形式。右边的这个图还是比较好理解的，就是当左边的这个图里面的元素跟元素中间产生交集的时候，那么你就需要在右边的这个图上把对应的两个元素中间连上线，表示它们两个可以进行互动。
And you can see that maybe this graph is a little empty. Like you could imagine an edge here, and an edge here, and an edge there, but those don't exist. And so maybe the game's a little bit dead.
然后你可以看到，像右边这个图，有一些元素之间没有产生连接，比如说球棒跟分数，对吧？然后球和分数，然后这个意味着你的游戏的内容可能会比较单薄。
So I want to use this as a visual throughout the rest of the presentation to represent the idea of a whole game. So you have some game, it doesn't matter what it is, and there's the different objects or mechanics in the game are these dots, and then the way the things in the game affect each other is the lines.
然后我想用这个思路来在接下来的这个演讲里面，让大家保持这样的一个思维方式。在我做的这个游戏里面，我想尽量的充实游戏的内容，然后尽可能的让游戏里面所有的元素之间都有这个线来连接。
So the reason why I wanted to talk about this, and the reason why we're going into the details of these visuals, is because it's the first time that I heard a very interesting idea about game design, where the idea was that for your game to be good, you want to maximize the number of entries in the matrix, right? You want the x's to be gone, and you want something interesting to happen anytime anything in the game interacts with anything else.
OK，其实这里是很重要的一点，就是我之所以要提到这个东西，是因为我第一次在刚才提到的传送门的 Kim 的演讲里面，是我第一次听到这个思维方式。如果你希望你自己的游戏足够好，然后有丰富的内容，然后有很强的互动性，那么你应该尽量的去增加这个矩阵里面有效的互动的条目。OK，
yeah. Okay, so I like these images for certain reasons. With the matrix version, you can imagine that, or you can see that if I add another object, that's one more column, but also one more row because it goes in both. And so if you imagine the number of empty cells that you add when you add an object, it's a lot, and it's more every time you add. It's as the rows get bigger and the columns get bigger.
所以刚刚提到这个表格上的横列和纵列，它的元素是一样的。所以每次你添加一个新要素到游戏里面的时候，你可以想象这个表格，纵横都会扩张，然后这个元素越多，这个表格的面积就越大。
And you know from basic math that the number of cells is n squared, where n is the number of objects. And the thing about squared, it goes up really fast as the number of objects go up.
你可以想象这个东西是叫做几何积增，你东西越多，它增长就越快。
And then in the graph version, it's similar. Every time I add a new dot, it has potential to have edges going to every single other dot. And as there are more dots, there's more edges every time.
然后每次增加一个点，就下面的那个图也是一样的，每次增加一个点，它能够连接的点也会增加，所以这个图也会变得越来越复杂。
And so this is a reminder that every time you add something to a game, you have a lot of work to do because it has to deal with everything already in the game. But then for the player, the amount of opportunity to have an interesting time goes up every time you add a new thing.
所以用我的话来讲，它可能是一个双刃剑。每次你导入一个新元素到你的游戏里面的时候，它都会跟游戏里面所有的东西有可能产生互动。所以你要去思考这些东西之间的互动关系。但同时，它也意味着你的游戏给玩家带来了更多的可能性，让玩家可以在你的游戏里体验到更多的内容。
Now, I don't recommend this as a way to actually design a game because it's not this simple actually, right? Two objects could interact in multiple ways, not just one. So one square wouldn't be enough. You could have interactions of 3 or 4 objects at once, and that's not included in what I just said. And maybe in a game, some things are pretty vague, and they're not really these discrete objects.
其实刚刚讲的这个手法它还是比较简单的，因为你可以想象有2个元素中间能够产生的互动可能不止一种方式。那同时也像刚刚也提到了，就是有很多两种、3种元素，它们可能不会产生互动，然后你就有很多空格。所以这是一个抽象的比较简单的一个方法，但我们这里可能不会太展开。
But nevertheless, I like the visual, and suppose now I say I want to make the greatest game ever. I want to figure out how to make games that are more interactive and more dense in terms of player opportunity. Then I might think about it in terms of adding more rows and columns or adding more edges to the graph.
所以尽管这个方法它并不是万能的，但是作为一个想要一直思考，想把自己的游戏做得非常有趣、非常的充实、量非常充实的一个开发者，我会把这个东西导入为我的一种思维方式，然后每次我在游戏里添加新元素的时候，我会用这种方式来自我思考怎么把这个游戏做得更好玩。
But there are 2 problems with this. One is that eventually things start feeling flat. You know, if you have some graph like this, you can add things, but at some point, adding a new thing feels like all the things that you already have, and it doesn't create a feeling of something new in your game.
Okay. 然后呢，也有一种情况是你导入更多的元素，但同时你的游戏也会变得很单薄，因为它们并不意味着你导入的元素一定有意义。
The other problem is the way games usually get designed. You know, you start with nothing, and as a designer, you're like, what do I put in my game? How should it be? And you work on it until it's fun, And then it was so hard to get there that once it's fun and people enjoy the game, you stop.
然后另一个问题是，作为一个开发者，你创作的从零到一的过程，你从一开始什么都没有的一个状态开始想，我应该把什么东西放到我的游戏里面，然后从这一步到达另外一个层级，也就是我的游戏开始变得有一定意义了，开始变得好玩了。但是呢，这一步到玩家能够真正的享受它，它依然还是有一定距离的。
And so everybody starts, at nothing, and they're building up, and they're building up. But then if the place where there's enough interactivity for fun is about the same place, then games all sort of end up in about the same place, and then they ship, and then they're done.
比如说，你可能像垒砖头一样垒很多可以互动元素，或者说可以玩的东西，但这些东西它不一定有意思，所以你可能垒到很多的砖头，垒到一定的高度了，但是你的游戏的可玩性或者趣味性依然还在原地。
So if I want to break through that and go higher, how do I do that?
所以我想达到这样一个高度，那我应该怎么做呢？
I've been thinking about this from the previous game, The Witness, where we have mechanics that combine together in a certain way.
在我上一个游戏《见证者 Witness》这个游戏里面，我曾经一直在思考这个问题，怎么去进行有趣的组合。
So in this game, there are these puzzle symbols, and you're not told how they work, but they were designed to create both be interesting in the early game and to create puzzles in the late game that have surprises.
在这个游戏里面，早期的解谜是比较单薄的，但是呢，他们的意图是让玩家理解，然后在后面的更多的谜题中找到趣味性。
And the way we make surprises is just there's little secrets written into the rules, and when the different mechanics combine, so for example, these purple stars and these orange things and the dots, they can all come together in puzzles.
所以，当玩家掌握了这个基本的解题思路之后，再去导入新的元素，比如说这些紫色的点也好，还有上面的这些不同的谜题解法也好，都是在沿用同一个思路的情况下，让这个游戏来变得更有意思。
And when they combine, they make surprises, but anyone who's played this game will notice that it's not like there are a ton of different puzzle symbols. There's a certain number, and it's because more than that would not be better. So as people who played the game would know, there's a certain number of puzzle symbols in the game. I don't remember exactly, but 7 or something like that. Just translate that.
所以，当玩家在玩这个游戏的时候，他这个游戏里面可能有一定的这个解谜的思路，比如说7种还是多少，然后。
And it's because more would not make the game better. Adding more different symbols starts to just get confusing because it all runs together in your head, and it's not better, and it doesn't create something new.
但是多于这7种解谜方式，那玩家可能就开始记不住了，他们会混乱。
And so I was thinking about this problem for a long time, and I was thinking maybe part of the issue is the puzzle symbols are really small in themselves. So what if we combine together things that are bigger?
所以刚刚讲的这个问题，我认为是游戏中的一个比较大的一个挑战。所以我在想很多方法来解决这个问题。比如说，如果不是这些比较小的这些符号，一个符号是一种解谜思路，但是如果我创造一些更大的不同点。
And that's where the idea of this game came from, is to combine things that are bigger.
这就是诚信秩序这个游戏的原点，就是做一些更大的不同的解谜方式的挑战。
So the reason there are 4 worlds in the game, it might be cool from a story standpoint or something, but the real reason is this game design experimentation reason.
所以大家可以看到这个游戏里面的它有很多区域，然后还可能有不同的剧情，但是这个游戏的开发原点是这种实验性的组合游戏解谜方式的挑战。
So here, I've put this diagram representing a separate game with all its own interactions, and the core idea in Order of the Sinking Star is that we start with 4 totally separate games, and they're all fun, which means they have lots of these dots and lots of lines already.
所以大家可以看到这4个大区域，其实它原始的想法是4种不同的游戏。然后呢，我们把这4种不同的游戏放在一起，它共同组成了诚信秩序这样的一个看起来是一体的东西。
And because we did that, separate, because they're separate in the beginning, we reserve the potential at some point in the game to combine them and have them start interacting with each other.
然后每一个区域，它们有各自的这样的一个图，然后来表示点跟点之间的连接。然后呢，这几个大区域之间又可以互相连接，然后这样才构成成型秩序的这样一个游戏的一体性。
So these bigger lines represent one entire world interacting with another entire world, right? And so there's 6 lines.
所以再重复一下，每个区域有它自己的点跟点的连接，然后这4个大区域跟相邻的区域之间也可以产生互动。
And this is a simplification, but if you draw out what happens, you know, when this world interacts with this world, all the objects in here, so all the dots, get to talk to all the dots in here, and really maybe it looks like that.
所以这只是一个很极简抽象的方法，但是呢，如果你非要说的话，那上面北方的区域跟东边的区域的点跟点之间也是可以产生互动和连接的，那它最终看起来可能是这样的一个效果。
Now, this might be another instance of the problem of things being too flat and messy. If you just keep throwing things at a player, at some point it's just more of the same. But the 4-world structure here lets us get around that.
所以这个东西我刚刚提过了，就是你的游戏可能会变得很平，然后呢，对玩家来讲，从玩家的视线来讲，他只是觉得这个游戏很混乱。我们可以继续讲。
So even though the amount of mechanics in the game is like this, right? There's over 1,000 puzzles, and the reason is because there's all this potential, there's all these lines. But in your mind, it's simpler because the warrior and the wizard and the thief, it makes sense they come from the same world, and your mind puts them together.
所以从玩家的角度来看，它可能是一个1000多个谜题，然后一个错综复杂的一个东西。但是呢，我们把它抽象成巫师，然后战士，然后盗贼这样的一种比较符号化的一个角色。然后对玩家来讲，从玩家的角度来讲，他看到的依然是右边的那个图，它会更简洁一些，它比较容易理解。
Similarly, the skipping stones and the lily pads, which people can play today, they fit together in their own world, and so it's simpler in your mind.
包括今天大家之后可以去试玩的这个南方的这个区域，它也是所有的元素在这个区域内自成一体。
And so we get all the power, all the expressive puzzle power of everything on the left, but it makes sense like the thing on the right.
所以如果我们在这里讲的是左边的一个情况，1000多个谜题，一个非常复杂的情况，对吧？但是呢，从玩家我们想要呈现给玩家的，或者玩家实际去玩这个游戏的时候感知到的是右边的那种情况。
So that's the basics of why the game is the way it is. And then I had this idea, and around the time we started the project, I was playing a bunch of games on the internet and found some that felt to me like they would be really good for this kind of construction.
所以刚刚讲的就是这个游戏思路的设计思路的起点，然后呢，这个已经可以一路追溯到过去我们在网上看到的一些比较著名的解密游戏，这些游戏启发我们。
These are the 4 games that we used, but the original idea was 6, which would have been too insane. We would not be done with the game now, so I'm glad we only did 4.
所以我们曾经从6个游戏中受到了启发，但是其实我们很高兴没有用到全部的这个点子，不然它真的会很乱。所以我们这里呈现的是最终我们采用的其中4种游戏组合。
So at the end, just to have a little bit of fun, I want to show you the games that we started with, and then compare that to the game as it is now.
OK， 然后想要给大家一些小小的娱乐环节，我们想在这里展示一下这个游戏最初的样子，然后大家可以和现在我们所呈现出来的效果进行比较。
So this is Heroes of Sokoban. This is a free web game that you can play in the browser.
是曾经是互联网上的一个免费游戏，然后这个也是刚刚提到的这个游戏思路来源之一，仓促翻译又推箱子。
As you see, the graphics are very basic. This is your guy when you walk around.
过去这个游戏图形非常的简单，它是一个网络上的免费游戏。
The sound is also very basic.
音效也非常的原始。
But people who have played the demo will recognize these levels. We've cleaned them up and made them better, but the basics of the game are similar.
所以现在大家可以这个推箱子已经产生了很多代了，很多进化了，然后我们的游戏图像也变得更好了，但是这个游戏的设计思路其实从来没有变。
So, and then we introduced the thief. So here's a letter with the thief, and she plays things. Well, she's not really a she in this game because the characters don't have any personality yet.
然后这是推向的这个游戏里面的道具角色，这个道具角色可以脱向的，但是其实原始的游戏里面这些角色并没有什么人格，也没什么设定。
So I'll start up the game here. It may take a second because this is not a fast lap.
然后这里是我们的程序秩序的演示。
You can see these are the equivalents, right? And game mechanically, the games are very similar, right? But it's just a very different presentation and a very different feel and story and all these things. But the mechanics are the same.
所以初期的成型秩序跟推箱子是非常像的，只是比如说画面可能更进化了，然后音效也更进化了，但是核心是一样的。
When I played these original games, I felt that they were really great games that I had a lot of fun with, but they were underappreciated because people look at this and it doesn't look like something they necessarily want to play.
所以当我在一开始玩这个游戏的时候，我觉得这个游戏很好玩，我得到很多乐趣。但是我也觉得这个游戏，推箱的这个游戏被严重的低估了，因为当一般的玩家看这个画面的时候，他可能不会觉得这个游戏是他去想玩那个东西的。
Just for fun, we'll compare direct levels. So this is from original Heroes of Sokoban. The goal is to grab 3 blocks, and then here's our version, which is a similar, a little bit more obstacles in it.
我们做了一个简单的对比，大家可以很清楚的看到画面上是如何进化的。这是一个很相似的关卡，虽然有多一些障碍物什么
的。We'll show one of the other games, which is this game called Promise.
然后这是成型秩序游戏灵感来源的另一款游戏。
I don't think I can. There we go. So similarly, you're just a guy who walks around from square to square, and very simple 2D graphics. I can grab this gem, dodge this thing, power this socket, and that lets me open a door. Move on, and you see this MIDI map down in the corner that shows me everything I've explored, but it's very low amount of information.
所以这个游戏，大家也可以看到它很直观，就是角色去捡起那个钻石，然后回来，然后把那个门打开，然后呢再前往下一个地图，然后它是格子的，一格一格的，然后探索过的区域会以迷你地图的方式显示出来，但是它的信息量其实也很少。
So here's the original game with this red beam in the starting room, and here's our starting room with the red beam, and the wrong way, another big jam.
所以跟刚刚演示的那个有红色激光的房间是一样的，这边是成型秩序的同样的一个很相似的一个设计，大家可以直接的对比一下。
And so the goal of the project was to take these interesting, unusual mechanics, because these games felt very fresh when I played them for the first time.
所以想法是把这些很有趣的组合，至少在一开始玩这些游戏的时候，它都是很有意思的一种玩法，然后把它们组合起来。
And both to make them more appreciable to a larger audience.
那这样才有可能让更多的玩家来注意到这些玩法的有趣之处。
And also just to have fun mashing them together and creating all these crazy levels.
And 对我来讲还有另外一个很有意思的事情，就是把这些玩法组合起来，然后来制作出很多疯狂的关卡。
So I think that's all that I wanted to say for this part. Thanks everybody.
那么以上就是吹哥这次的演讲的全部内容。谢谢大家的参与。下面我会把麦克风交还给我们的评审书。
好的，非常感谢吹哥的分享。那我们接下来呢会等这个工作人员把沙发放好，我们会和吹哥进行一些提问环节。那么我对吹哥的追问问题是，吹哥曾经在演讲中提到过，高预算的游戏通常来说它在创意上就比较保守。那么吹哥现在这种看到有意思的游戏，去争取授权这样一种方式，是否是他回馈解谜社群的一种方式？
Yes, I would say that was one of the motivations. Is both for the designers and the players, right? It's like if I can make something nice with other designers' games, then the designers could benefit by having more people know their game, and then players can see something cool that they wouldn't have known about otherwise.
所以我觉得这是一个很有意义的事情，因为我去请求这些授权，然后这个过程对开发者来说，那可以让他的游戏机制被更多的人注意到。
同时也是就是玩家也可以体验到。
玩家也可以体验到更多的对。
So，让我们进入到第二个问题。On this point, so how did you arrive at the current 4 big mechanics? You mentioned that you started with 6.
Yeah.
And what made you decide that these are the final puzzle pieces to this one game? And have there been any changes or switches along the way?
So part of this is just what you do. Like, this game has taken a long time, so for the first several years, we're figuring a lot of these things out.
然后在我们开发的初期，因为这个游戏开发花了很长的时间，然后在这个游戏开发的初期，我们其实花了很多时间来，尝试理清我们的想法。
I would say, even when I thought there were 6 games, these were the first 4, so there wasn't any swapping out a whole game ever.
然后一开始是6个游戏，但是其实呢，这4个游戏是最初就已定好的，所以它其实并没有说我们删除什么。
But there were a lot of changing rules of the original games so that they would combine better when things come together, and also sometimes simplifying.
只是随着游戏开发的这个过程，我们自然的注意到有些机制配合的更好，然后呢，有时候我们也想把这个东西进行一些简化。
Sometimes, when you have a game that it's its own game, you feel as a designer like it needs some things that are pretty complicated to be interesting. But then, when it's more like an introduction, because well, go ahead and say that part, because this next is going to be big.
所以我们注意到这些原始的玩法里面，有一些是这个原来的开发者他有意图的把它变得很复杂，来让这个游戏变得更有趣。
So the thing that I should reemphasize is all the stuff I was talking about, just with the 4 worlds, is a small introduction, and then the game explodes. All those lines is the game exploding after the introduction with all new things.
然后这个对我们的游戏来讲，我们这一开始的4个世界其实是一个一开始是一个简化的方式来呈现的，但是在最后在后期会呈现一个比如说几何级的一个爆炸，信息量的爆炸。
And so sometimes there are complications in games that are not worth it, like it's like they make the machine move less smoothly when everything comes together, and we smooth those out. And then sometimes, well, there's a second category, which is, when you have an object from one game that's never seen an object from another game, how do they interact? And the designer needs to make choices there.
所以我们在进行反复的试错的时候，注意到有一些复杂的设计，让这个原来的玩法变得更有趣的，在我们的游戏里面是不必要的。然后另外一种我们注意到的事情是，当有一些玩法进行组合的时候，这个元素在另外一种玩法里面它不存在，那我们需要从零开始去思考这2个元素怎么组合。
Maybe that's enough of an answer for that one.
OK， 这个可能就是我的关于这个问题的回答。
那我们进入到下一个问题。So everyone deduces and understands puzzles at a different pace. How do you make a difficulty curve that could cover players of all sorts of so-called puzzle literacies or puzzle abilities? Is the open world design of the witness an answer to this? And what new stuff or philosophy have you taken on for this game?
Well, I like the open world design for that reason, because if you're stuck on something, you can go somewhere else, right? There are many games in history that are more linear puzzle games, and if you're stuck in those, you just have to look on the internet, and before the internet, you just couldn't play the game anymore, and that's not very good.
我关于开放世界这个设计的，我比较喜欢的一点是，当我在游戏里面卡住的时候，我可以去别的地方，对吧？因为在互联网早期，或者说没有互联网的时代，玩家如果在一个游戏里面卡住了，那就没有办法玩下去了。有互联网的话，你还去搜攻略什么的。
Also, though, in this game, we as designers spend a lot of time trying to make puzzles less hard, but keeping them equally interesting.
我们也花了很多时间来让这个解谜，不那么难，但同时呢，还是依然非常有趣。
So, one thing that people might think about a puzzle game, even puzzle designers think this, is just, oh, a puzzle game is good if it's really hard, if it's like a challenge and you have to grind to beat it.
有很多游戏开发者可能会有这样的一个想法，就是解谜游戏它得难才有意思，它得让玩家绞尽脑汁的去想，然后达成了，它才是有意思。
But when you're 5 years into making a game, and you come into work and you're playing puzzles that someone designed, and you feel yourself like, oh, this is just, I'm tired. This is too much work. You start to realize, oh, if I'm tired, players are really going to be tired, right?
然后当我在这个游戏上开发超过好几年5年了，然后我自己在创作这个谜题的时候需要绞尽脑汁，然后把我自己弄得精疲力竭的时候，我注意到一个事情，就是我自己在设计谜题都这么累了，那玩家玩起来一定会比我更难。
And so we spend a lot of time looking at puzzles and saying, how do we keep the cool idea of the puzzle that you discover in the process of solving it? And sometimes that does have to be difficult to be interesting, but can we remove any difficulty that's not necessary, right?
所以我们注意到，或者说尝试在做这件事情，就是在让这个谜题不那么难的时候，同时来保持它的趣味性。这个趣味性跟难度是要分开的。
Because that's what, if the value of a game is just that it's hard, like a hard puzzle game, then maybe it's kind of the same as every hard puzzle game because you're getting the same value from all of them.
对，所以如果说一个解谜游戏的价值是来自于它们难度的话，那么所有的解谜游戏的价值呢都是一样的，因为它们只需要难就可以了。
But, the value in this game is when I showed the lines in the graph or the contents of the boxes. It's very much a game that speaks to the player through the mechanics that happen, right? As the player, you're supposed to observe and enjoy the cool things that happen when the objects come together.
但是对于《晨星之序》这款游戏，我们希望它能够提供的价值是，像我刚刚显示给玩家的那个图形一样，当玩家在玩这个游戏的时候，这个游戏会尝试告诉玩家什么地方是有趣的，然后什么地方是有挑战性的。
And so we want people to see and have fun with that stuff, and not just be grinding mains.
然后我希望大家在玩这个游戏的时候，能够找到这些有趣的地方，而不是绞尽脑汁的去解谜。
我们可以快进2个问题，快进1个问题，先跳过下一个问题，因为车哥刚刚的答复等于是和这个问题是有联系的。You basically answered part of the next question. Just like you said right now, and you mentioned in previous interviews, over the development of the game, you've decided to reduce the complexity of some larger puzzles, longer puzzles, and make most levels only test the core way of thinking. So, do you feel like this should apply to all puzzle games, or is this more specific to this game because of the scale, of the size of it?
It's very difficult to say that something should apply to everything. I don't think I should do that. But yes, for this game, part of it is because it's so big. It's, if there's work to set up a puzzle so you can solve it, and you do that work, and then you do similar work on the next level and similar, maybe for 5 levels that's fine, or maybe for 10 levels. But after 100 levels, after 500, it's too much. And streamline all that out was good for this game.
所以说，这个很难说它适用于所有的情况，但是对我们的晨星之序来说，可能是有一点吧。但是你也可以想象，就是在1500个关卡，你可以这么弄，对吧？但是你把它扩展到100个关卡，对吧？更多，它会真的让你觉得丰富。
好，那我们回到上一个问题。You've never shied away from timing or action-based puzzles. What do you say to the view that this kind of puzzles are not that pure or that thinking? What's the range of suitable amount of timing and action in a puzzle game?
Yeah, so we have a rule in this game, which is when there's an action puzzle, it's about the logic of the timing, it's not about twitch skills.
在成型之序里面，我们其实是有一个原则，当这个解谜是关于动作的时候，我们倾向于是让玩家观察到动作的逻辑，而不是时机。
So for example, a little bit of a spoiler, but if people play the Skipping Stones area, there's, for example, a puzzle where you need to do something before a stone finishes skipping, but the puzzle's about realizing that, and then once you realize that, it's not supposed to be that hard to actually do it. In fact, so we have a run button, and our rule as a designer is we need to be able to solve it without the run button.
所以今天大家后面会看到这个南方的这个区域，漂浮的石头的一个关卡，在这个关卡里面，有一些地方是玩家需要去观察，在石头完成移动之前需要去做一些事情来完成这个解谜的。然后我们游戏里面其实也有一个跑的一个键，但是我们在设计这个游戏的时候有一个原则，就是这个谜题必须要在不使用奔跑的这个操作的前提下也能够完成谜题。
那么关于这个问题，我又想追加问一下吹哥，关于就是近年来非常火的所谓知识锁的这个类型的平台解谜类游戏，因为我觉得这和这个所谓的动作和抓时机的点应该是有所联系的。I want to follow up by asking, how do you view the very popular subgenre, the so-called Metroidvania games, most of the puzzle platformers that requires you to progress with knowledge. How do you view this kind of games when it relates to this sort of action and timing-based puzzles?
I think that's a really interesting genre. My previous game, The Witness, could be considered similar in that, the thing that keeps doors locked is whether you know what the puzzles mean.
我们其实大家应该也能想象得到，我们前一个游戏《见证者》威斯汀那个游戏是有一点类似于这个设计的，也就是说它有些锁着的门，让玩家可能要之后回来打开的门。
And that's maybe very active in this game in some way. Not exactly in the Metroid way, but if you understand how the objects really work, then you can go through some puzzles really fast. Like it's not about untying a really complicated knot. It's about realizing you could use a mirror in a specific way.
所以在这个游戏里面，其实是虽然有一点，但是玩家也可以自然的去注意到它有别的方式来解开这个划线，所以它不一定只有一种方法。
好的，我们进到最后一个问题，第6个问题。You've streamed yourself playing lots of new and even unreleased puzzle games, and actually I think quite a few local Chinese developers of puzzle games have had their game played by you. What's the most recent, maybe 2 to 3 games that makes you go wow or makes you super impressed? And what other puzzle games do you look forward to, whether big or small?
I'm not necessarily good at answering this kind of question because it's always hard to remember. But it's not even because I play too many games. It's just I'm thinking so hard about this stuff that whatever I played falls out of my brain.
所以我个人并不擅长回答这种问题，因为我真的没有办法想起来我曾经玩过的一些东西，而且每次我尝试去想的时候，我的脑子会爆炸。
I could mention 2 games. One of them that I like, a puzzle game that is not out yet, but I played the demo.
我可以提到2个游戏，其中一个还没有发售，但是我玩过它的 demo。
It's a game called Trifolium: The Adventures of Gary Pretzelneck. I don't know if that translated at all.
你是不是知道中文名吗？
We can probably add subtitles
Yeah.
or get the title.
But the idea of the game is it's like a snake game, but you're infinitely long, and you need to tie yourself in knots.
所以它是像一个贪吃蛇一样的游戏，但是你是无限长的，然后你需要把自己打进一个结这种。
I think I've played a similar game on Edge, but maybe not the same name. I think it's where you can go under platforms and go under yourself.
Yeah, maybe it's also on
Maybe it's
Edge,
the
but
maybe it's the same game. Maybe.
So in terms of Chinese games, I mean, the two that stand out the most are a little bit less indie, I guess. I mean, Black Myth, obviously. Also, Dyson Sphere Program. I had a lot of fun playing.
戴森球计划啊，我个人是一个个人很享受的游戏。
All right. I want to have a more vague question. I'll explain first. 那么因为我们事先准备的问题里面有一个，我觉得特别想问吹哥的，我在这边先问一下，之后我们来现场提问。我想问的就是，吹哥觉得对于推箱子这个类型的游戏来说，它是否设计空间是有限的？我们人类对它的开发是不是有穷尽的？我们已经开发了多少？I want to ask, do you feel like that the Sokoban style or genre of games has a finite design space, and how further along are humans in the way of exhausting all of it?
So I think the point of the speech was to show that the design space gets very big very fast. Even for just this game, right? We had to just stop making puzzles. We could have kept making puzzles that were really fun and interesting, at least maybe another 500 or something. And that's before we had to stop and think. That's just the ideas that, because it just creates, all those lines that were a big mess is just ideas, right?
所以，回答这个问题，在我们的诚信秩序这个游戏里面，我们的问题现在最大的问题是我们需要停止制造更多的谜题了。因为真的要说的话，我还可以想出来，比如说500个，再多500个这样。因为刚刚像大家看到那个一方战马一样的这个点和点之间的连接，我们其实是这个游戏的本身就是无穷的可能性。
And so, if you start then changing, even if you just made the same game as this, but with different base games, then that opens the space up a lot more already, and you could make hundreds of those.
然后就连这个游戏基础的这个玩法本身，你还可以想出100个它的那个改版。
And then there are all sorts of, so there are Sokoban games that I've played that I haven't seen anyone do a good job on. So for example, game designer Jack Lance, who is no longer with us, but he worked on this game.
我们曾经有一个团队成员杰克兰斯，他现在已经跟我们不在一起了，但是他也在我们的全新之飞这个游戏开发中工作过。
He had a free web game that you can play called Enigmash. That's not going to translate at all.
他做过3个网页游戏，然后那个英文
这个我可以解释一下，他做的那个游戏叫 Enigmash，名字是 Enigma 谜和 Mash 就是混搭混拼，就是把东西拼在一起的这样一个，也是一个 puzzle script 的引擎。刚才吹哥演示过的那种引擎的游戏。
Yeah, and that game's about crossing between realities in a very different way than this game. And I've never seen, somebody could make that, and I just haven't even seen it.
然后那个游戏也是关于在不同的现实中间穿梭和诚信秩序不太一样，也是一个很新的点子。然后我也没有见到有任何其他类似的东西出现过。
All right, I can explain some more about Enigmash.
If you want, yeah.
I really enjoyed it.
It's really cool.
Yeah, yeah. 那 Enigmash 这个游戏呢，它有一个非常就是第一眼让人非常惊艳的机制，就是它的地图是就是平台和俯角是混搭在一起的。你将一个俯角的推箱子的游戏中的箱子推到一个平台世界中的时候，它会因为重力而掉下去，并且因此有完全不同的交互形式。那我觉得，因为吹哥过去也在直播中也好，也在演讲中也好，特别提到过这个游戏，大家感兴趣的话，可以自己去尝试搜索一下。 一定会很有收益。All right, I think we will just go to the audience questions section. 那么我们接下来就进入到观众提问的环节大家可以踊跃举手，踊跃举手。
您的游戏它吸引了很多同屏的人，然后它像是吸引了很多像在 Witness 那个里面，就是自愿愿意举着那个蜡烛去走过一个水潭的人。但是我不知道您在开发的过程中是否会有担忧，就是这样子同屏的人可能没有想象中那么多，然后您会对就是受众他的期待可能跟之前的期待不一样，就是这方面您是怎么考虑的？谢谢。
Yeah, so there are at least two different kinds of indie, right? There are indies who want to make things that are just like big expensive games, but they're starting as a small team. But there's also indies who are small because they want to do things that don't make sense at a very high budget level because they're too strange and maybe the audience is too small.
所以说基本上有两种独立游戏的形式嘛，一种是小团队想做一个大声的东西，一个牛逼的东西，但是另外一种是一个小团队想要去做一个很奇怪的点子，然后想要去做一些可能不是很多人能 get 到的东西。
So I've always been in that second category. To me, making the game really interesting first is the most important, and I don't even think about selling it for a long time because if you start thinking, are people going to like this? Are enough people going to buy this? Then you start making decisions that pull the game more toward what a AAA game would do. You lose your originality.
所以，对我来讲，我一直都是第二个类型的那种开发者。我起一个项目的时候，我只想去让它做得更有趣。如果说我开始想象要这个游戏在商业上是怎么能够怎么得到商业上的成功，怎么让玩家去更多玩家来买它，那这个思路会变得更像3A。那同时呢，这个游戏也会丢失它的原创性。
Because bigger companies are already trying to think, how do we make the game that gets the most players? And they have more resources than you. So if you're a little indie and you're trying to compete with, Electronic Arts for a marketing budget, that's never going to work. And so I think the key for indies is to be creative and to do something original.
这件事情已经有很多大公司在做了，像 EA 这种3A 公司。然后如果一个小团队想要去跟大公司竞争资源的话，他们肯定是会输的。所以我觉得独立团队的这个成功的要点还是保持自己的原创性。
And then the other thing to say is just a small audience in the modern world is actually quite big on the internet and with all the countries together and all that. And so you can really make things that are what you want to make. Like you don't have to. There's some idea that you can't make what you want. You have to make what will sell. And I've never done that, and so far people buy the games, And so it's been a really nice. I'm thankful that people buy the games, but it works.
在这个互联网时代，其实哪怕你做的游戏受众很小，但是呢，这个很小依然是囊括了很多人在里面的。所以我觉得开发者就应该做他们自己想做的，然后呢，自然会有人来买。然后我个人也非常感激那些依然在买我的游戏的玩家们。
Thank you for the question.
谢谢你们提问。
好的，那么我们从靠中间的部分，这边这位戴帽子的观众，戴帽子和眼镜的观众。
Thanks for the opportunity. So, Jonathan, welcome to China. And yeah, thank you. So I know that all of your games are made by your own engine. And considering that most of those commercial games are made in, say, Unreal or Unity, do you think it is potentially achievable for a puzzle game? So, for instance, this one to be made in that one, in a more commercial engine, or why would you make the decision to use your own one?
你可以用中文。
就是我想问一下，他为什么要用自己的引擎来做，而不是用那种比较通用的商业引擎？
part of it is we just like making technical things.
Yeah, good.
Somebody has to be making new technical stuff, right?
就对我来讲，纯粹就是因为总有人要来做一些新的技术方式。
Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah, there are some tricks in this game. So, you know, in the trailer we do this, and you can do it on the overworld, where you go to the overhead map, and we do it literally by just pulling the camera up into the sky and looking down on the whole world.
在这个游戏《诚心之序》里面，我们的大地图到小地图的一个过渡，其实它完全就只是一个摄像机的动作。
And, you know, I think if you try to do that in Unreal or Unity without doing a great deal of extra work, it's going to just go chug, chug, chug.
如果在 Unity 里面想做到实现同样的效果的话，那其实是非常困难的。它可能看上去是一个非常不流畅的一个过渡效果。
But, you know, aside from a few things like that, you could make this game in another engine. But part of what's going on is there's a whole big there's a new programming language, right? And so we're testing the programming language by making an engine in it and all these things. And yeah.
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 其实还有很多别的东西也在尝试，比如说我们有一个新的这个编程语言，然后我们才尝试一个。
Yeah, personally, I think part of the fun that came from your game is because it's made by your own engine. It's my business.
Well, you know, there is also a thing. A lot of the time, you can look at a Unity game and you can tell it's a Unity game.
Yes.
It looks Unity. A lot of Unreal games look Unreal, and so at least you also can get some originality that way. Even if people don't, like a lot of players won't quite understand consciously, but they'll see it. Like, oh, this is
Yeah.
所以用 Unity 做的游戏有 Unity 的味儿，然后用 Unreal 做的游戏有 Unreal 的味儿，就是玩家可能并不会去注意这些东西，但他们的潜意识是能够接收到的。
Thank you. Pretty
Thank you.
end.
好，那我们从后排这位站着的观众先来问一下。
Well, I heard some rumors that the animal well is not on the list of your and that's why. 我看一下这个动物井，我听说动物井不在那个吹哥的那个好游戏的列表上，为什么？
好尖锐。What he's talking about is I have a Steam curator list of games, and the review, I put things on there when I really like them, and the review is this is a good game, always.
所以就解释一下，吹哥他有一个 Steam 鉴赏家的列表，然后他会把他自己认为的好游戏放在表上。
I think, you know, sometimes these decisions are very arbitrary and based on how I feel at a certain time. I think I was just grumpy toward the end of Animal Well because I was pretty tired. And just so as the game goes, the Animal Well is very structured in the beginning, and then there are more and more secrets that are like doing arbitrary, tricky things. And I didn't want to do those, you know. And so I felt a little bit left behind by the game.
其实就是我其实玩了这个动物之井，但是呢。我可能纯粹是任性的觉得不喜欢它，是因为这个游戏在一开始它的结构是比较不错的，节奏也比较不错，但是它的结局是有点 tricky， 然后比较玩一些技巧，然后
我来解释一下，就是车哥刚才说的是，当时他玩的时候心情也不是更好，因为动物井在一开始的时候结构是非常紧凑的，但是随着游戏的展开到后期会有越来越多的秘密，而这些秘密呢，很多可能是需要做一些高难度、高技巧或者是非常复杂的一些操作来进行。吹哥当时呢也觉得自己是比较疲劳了，玩得累了，所以呢就不想去把那些所有的秘密全都去做到。那他就觉得是自己就是游戏跑得太前面了，自己没有跟上，被游戏给抛弃了这样一种感觉。
But, you know, I might have felt if I just had more energy that week or something, maybe I would have liked it.
如果我内政有更多精力的话，那其实我可能会把它打完。
What I will say is, last month on the WooCash podcast, I think, we did a conversation where Billy Basso, the designer of Animal Well, was also there, and we talked a lot about this game, but we also talked about Animal Well and this idea of how do you tell players that they've got to the end of the main part of the game? And how do you tell them what's extra and hard and weird, and it's okay if they don't play it, right?
所以在前几个月的一个播客上面，我曾经讨论成型之序的时候，其实也提到了动物情，然后我们有讨论这样的一个话题，就是在这个游戏里面，你怎样让玩家成功的跑到游戏的结局，然后同时呢，又怎样去让玩家注意到游戏中这些额外的元素，这是两个分开的东西。
刚才吹哥主要就是提了，就是动物景的制作人 Billy Bassel 和他是一起参加了那个播客，所以他们讨论就是怎么告诉玩家，就是你到这里是游戏的结局了，一个节点，后面的可能是一些额外的东西你如果不是特别想的话，不用特别专心的去做这样一点。
And may I ask that is there some results that your discussion of that question, like how to tell the player?
You know, it's when you're a designer, a lot of what you do is just internalize ideas, but it doesn't lead to an answer right away because different games are different. And so the right way to design some next game that I would work on, it really depends on that game.
所以作为一个设计者，我脑子里面有很多想法，但这些想法不一定会被直接翻译成最终的这个执行设计。关于下一个游戏，我现在的想法其实也没有成型。
So you know, there's no specific, I think, laws that we came up with, but one thing I would say is I personally like it when there's like a clean hygiene to the game or something where I know what's expected of me as a player and I know very clearly what's extra and
like there's a map and there are secret level, extra levels labeled on them.
Yeah, or you know, sometimes, so you might have a platformer that's an action platformer, and then maybe there's some extra levels that are just crazy, right? And am I expected to do those for the real game, or is that just for people who are really fans of the game, right? And sometimes that's clear, and sometimes it's not clear, and I like it when it's clear.
吹哥说的大意就是呢，这个当玩一个游戏，这个游戏里面可能会有一些非常疯狂的一些设计，对吧？然后作为一个普通的玩家，我是去挑战这些关卡，其实有必要的呢，还是我可以忽略他们，然后之后再回来挑战，然后怎么样？有时候这个界限非常的明显，然后有时候它非常模糊。然后呢，吹哥个人会说，我比较喜欢当这个界限非常明显的时候，当这个疯狂的设计跟这个游戏的主线是分开很明确的，玩家可以稍后再回来审视，他比较倾向于得势。
好的，那么我们时间估计还能最后再问一个问题，我看一下，怎么办？就觉得我选择的话，这个压力在我了，是不是？我闭上眼睛选。那边那个方向，这条线上，
地景。
我睁眼后看到了第6个人。你不要做动作，做出这个守门员扑球的动作，会不会受到影响？那边那位蓝色头发的吧。
你好，就我的这个问题可能会更 general 一点，而不是关于游戏的，因为我们都知道，随着人的年纪变大，或者说变成熟，你的一些想法是会跟年轻的时候有不同的。我特别想知道吹哥，尤其是比如说对于10年前自己的一些人生观上，或者是游戏开发上的一些想法，你认为对现在回头来看的话，转变最大的一个想法是什么？
So this question is more generic, it's not about the game. So she wants to ask about like as people growing up, being aged, experience, and more life experience, your way of thinking might change. So compared to 10 years ago when you're making game, what is the biggest change on your way of thinking?
So she's calling me old. You know, I will say there are things. So in an earlier game like Braid, there are puzzles where I like the idea of the puzzle as a designer, but they get kind of messy, like they're not as clean to solve as I wish they were. And as a newer designer, I did that puzzle anyway because I really like something about it, you know?
所以在他的第一款游戏《时空幻境》里面，他的那些谜题，他很喜欢这些谜题的设计，但这些谜题呢还是挺乱的，就是当玩家解谜的时候还是挺乱的。但是作为一个新的游戏开发者，他还是很喜欢自己的这些设计。
But with more experience, we understand that usually you can get rid of the messy part and make a better version, you know? Like once you've identified what's good about this, you can just keep trying to do it in different ways until you find a way that's really clean and does justice to the idea, really.
当你变得更有经验以后呢，你可以去找到这些很混乱的设计中的好的那些点，然后呢，用更干净的方法来设计，专注一些好的点，把它设计成一种更干净的方式。
那当时这种初生牛犊不怕虎的精神，是否会让你觉得能带来更多这种 messy 的感觉，能带来更多创意上的灵感？跟现在这种比较experience 的情况。
When you are new designer, you might enjoy the messy design, but does that mean the messy design gives you more ideas, more innovative?
I don't understand how a messy design would be.
She was asking when you are new and bold, having this kind of messy parts to the game, does it increase the originality to some extent? Would you say?
There's different kinds of messy. There's one kind of messy that's, you know, let's say something is very polished on one end, or something is very expressive, and I just did it, and it's crazy and cool on the other end. And
就混乱有两种方式，一种是可能是更polish， 怎么说呢，就是更成熟的，但是混乱；另一种是就纯粹的想要表达更多东西所带来的混乱。
And I think that's good. That expressive, you know, non-polished thing can be very good. But when I'm talking about earlier puzzles of mine, I'm not thinking of that. I'm thinking of, I tried to polish it, and it was still not clean.
所以，如果你想表达很多东西，那同时又不成熟，那这种 messy 这种混乱，它并不一定是个坏事。但是当我个人去审视我早期的那些想法的时候，我觉得他们这个混乱是一种不干净的混乱。
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
好的，那么我们的这个现场提问环节呢，因为时间的关系，就差不多到。